Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Lucas Hardie, often better known as RangeofStrength on Instagram, coach and practitioner of, quote, unconventional methods of strength and flexibility. That's probably why I wanted you on here most. And you were already booked, but Jordan Syatt was a recent guest. So if anybody likes Jordan, go check that out. But we recently talked a lot about you on air. You've actually been a big influence on him and his quest to do the splits and all this sort of stuff. So big focus on strength and mobility for Jordan. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the chat.
And for everybody listening, one of the real joys for these podcasts is, so Lucas, you and I have interacted over social media a bit, but we've never met in person. You know, it's not been a ton of interaction. So selfishly, I get to deepen my connection to people in the industry through this. In addition to a lot of my guests are actually really good friends that I know from my travels. So I guess we could dive right in. Why should people get outside of the conventional array of common gym exercises?
That's a good question. And I think the big one, even for me, when I kind of segued in that direction more over the years, was to just get a better understanding of my body. When you start out in the gym, you start a fitness journey. For the most part, a lot of people follow a cookie cutter approach, which is good because you need some solidarity there. You need some consistency. You need to understand the basics. And I think what happens a lot of times for people is like when it gets to a point of going beyond that and just gaining a better understanding of, maybe we could even look at vulnerable positions or how they might handle themselves in different scenarios. I think that when we start to look at unconventional methods that get used across the board in a lot of different types of disciplines, it helps us gain a better understanding of how we might do that. And that's one of the things that I try to bridge the gap with my content and the things that I share is, not necessarily just being silly with it, which you could just present a lot of weird movements and, it could be like, okay, that looks cool, but like, well, where's the value in that? Or where could I start potentially learning to explore those things? And that's kind of what I try to do is like find people that or disciplines or areas that do these things that are a little outside of traditional practices or training methods and present them in such a way where we can find value in them.
Let's define what, to give someone a picture, because obviously this is audio. We're not working out in the gym, right? It's not a YouTube video. Define like what would be unconventional movement for you. And maybe because you alluded to being silly, because we see a lot of the quote circus type stuff. What's important to differentiate between random circus performative stuff that sometimes trainers get their clients to do, sometimes people are doing in the gym, standing on unstable surface stuff tends to be a good example. What differentiates progressive, and I think there's the key, unconventional movement versus the silly stuff, the circus stuff?
I think strength would be kind of the avenue that I try to go the most with that approach is like understanding how to get stronger in these different ways, rather than kind of, simply exploring them or demonstrating a movement. It's like, how could we think about ways that we could progressively overload these patterns? I think, yeah, mobility training in general has developed itself so much to a point now where this is where a lot of the thought process is going with a lot of systems is, we train to open up the range of motion in this pattern. How do we now start loading it? How do we now start thinking about making the tissue and the connective tissue and tendons stronger in these positions? And I think that, not only just doing that in isolation, but thinking about how that might be integrated in larger scales of movements is the key aspect or the key missing component there. Getting that stronger over time, sort of thing.
So is consistency within what you're practicing one of the critical differentiators versus what we call the circus stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if we're going to start taking odd lifts, odd movements, and building them into a structured training regime, it has to consistently be done over time for you to gain a good understanding of its value and how you can use it. So in a lot of ways, like things that I program differently it can look very traditional to how we would program a traditional lift like a deadlift, but we're kind of considering how it can be done in this way. there's lots of ways you can explore it, whether it be even changing up accessory movements. Yeah, very specific to strength training in general. But yeah, that would be, it doesn't really, for me, like programming doesn't change much when I think about these unconventional patterns. I still have the same hat on that I would when I'm, programming traditional training models that you see today or that we've been using forever. It's just more about like injecting different things in here and there and changing up certain training goals. Goals is a big one too, right? Is like if someone is looking to do something different, looking to move their body in a different way or get stronger in different patterns, it's like how do we identify those goals and how do we actually, put some performance measurements in place for those things. So yeah, given my background in powerlifting and strength training, it still has very much a similar approach to that, but it's more just injecting different movements in and gaining an understanding of newer techniques and things like that.
We could probably look at this through the lens of, because I want to give people some visuals. Again, Jordan Syatt trying to learn the splits. I think
Yeah.
what he's doing follows what you just said. He's been
Yeah.
progressively working through greater range of motion. He is loading it. He is consistent over time. And he has a specific goal, which in that episode, he talked about wanting to be able to take a photo with his kids, Jean-Claude Van Damme style. Do you want to explain that a little bit more? And maybe through the lens of Jordan's goal of doing the splits?
Yeah, for sure. I think when a lot of people look at flexibility specific goals, it's really hard to kind of sift through the weeds of like how you might get there. And, traditionally one would hold splits and eventually try to hope over time that you get deeper into that range of motion. Where with even just how we've changed the scope of how we train mobility and develop flexibility in different patterns, we can think of just kind of reverse engineering a split position. So we look at the splits now and we say like, okay, how can we break down the demands required to get in that position to see where we have to put a little bit more attention to detail to gain a better understanding of what's required of us in those positions. And I think that's like one of the breakthroughs Jordan's been having with it because he has a powerlifting background as well. So we really connected that way, both as like former powerlifters, because we started, looking at the splits as a main lift. It's like, okay, if our splits is our main lift, we're just going to kind of reverse the approach that we would have used in powerlifting, where we would start with a squat. Instead, we're going to finish with the squat, which is the split, and we're going to build ourselves up in all these like positions that's required of us. So, at the start, it does require us to really condition the body. The splits itself is a position that requires a really high degree of conditioning for some of the smaller muscles required to hold that position. So, it's like understanding that. But I think any coach that has that training background and history, like once you start making the connections that way, it becomes a lot easier to start to visualize how you might get there. And then you can start setting other obtainable, like measurable goals along the way, which when you look at a split, it's kind of like looking at like a 500-pound squat. And you can only currently squat 100 pounds, right? So you're just like, how am I going to get that 500-pound squat? You start breaking down other goals along the way. So be a regressed position. It might be looking at some kind of stance position. We start actually measuring his success and ensuring that those targets before he's really focusing on like just forcing himself into a certain range of motion. So like when you have those like set goals and set up for you, it's a lot easier to start visualizing and like, okay, I think this is actually obtainable for me because you start ticking some of those boxes along the way. And it's just like any other fitness journey, right? Like learning to run, learning to lift. It's all just like making sure you have goals set up. You actually know what you're working for, and that's laid out progressively over time in a program.
So I'm trying to give people now some visualizations of other things because the splits won't be for everybody. And that's a very specific, hey, Jordan wants to do the splits because I think a lot of this
Yeah.
stuff probably has to do with what are some of the other reasons for people to train unconventionally, let's just say, for their well-being?
Well, I think flexibility training in itself is a really unconventional approach to training because most people don't know how to do it, and it hasn't necessarily been presented in a way where you can make connections to what you already know. So even in that way, when I talk about flexibility training and how to improve your body's range of motion, it is a very unconventional approach or thought process for a lot of people. So in that way, I think it does come down to like, okay, if I don't want to obtain the splits, maybe that's a goal that's very out of reach for me. What kind of movements or flexibility specific ranges of motion should I be working towards? And how can I get there, sort of thing. So like that's one of my big goals with that, is like helping people identify those targets. Like how would we now use these unconventional movements to help us? Like a Jefferson curl is a very unconventional movement. It's becoming more popularized, which is cool, but it's still like when people see it, they're like, that doesn't look safe. Why would I use that? What's it going to help me for? And I use it primarily for improving range of motion and flexibility through the hamstrings and the posterior chain. So I think in through that lens, for me, when I talk about unconventional training, I try to really relate it to flexibility. Even with a lot of the strength stuff, it's like if you have improved movement qualities, these patterns are a lot easier for you to train and have access to. Whereas someone who hasn't, developed the flexibility, if they're thinking of getting up and down off the ground, let alone with weight, like thinking of doing that without their hands to help them, it's like, you can start thinking of ways to actually improve your movement patterns and move towards different goals that lead you towards those qualities of movement that I think a lot of people are looking for. They just don't necessarily know how to approach it in their training.
Let's I can sort of break down the Jefferson curl a little bit in a way that I
Yeah.
think people understand. 'Cause someone hearing what's a Jefferson curl, I don't know what that is. So to oversimplify, it's a rounded back deadlift. Now, I think when people see the rounded back deadlift, we've been conditioned, hey, rounding your back during a deadlift is really bad. But people automatically may go to thinking about lifting maximal loading, with a rounded back. So there's two kinds. One is when you get very trained powerlifters who have over years gotten used to the adaptations of that position. There may be some survivorship bias, the ones that just are really durable there. There's an element of that. But they're good at the skill of being in that position. They have a good brace, and that
Yeah.
it can be a very good way to maximally express lift, because if you hunch sort of round your shoulders, you may still have a neutral lumbar spine, but you
Mhm.
rounded your thoracic, you could actually reach lower and move more load. Okay. But that doesn't mean that someone just starting out should go right to that. Or what we also sometimes see is videos of kids in the gym. They don't have the skill. They grab the bar with a straight back, and then they get pulled into a rounded back with a load that is clearly too heavy, which is a load management issue. And then younger people are still resilient, but to me, that presents injury risk. Let's now go the other way. And I used this analogy recently on a podcast, like picking up my cat. I don't want to pause, breathe, brace, reach down and try to grab him. He's fast. If he doesn't want to come up, he's long gone. So I
Yeah.
want to be able to, I may have to twist sideways, load, bend at my spine without necessarily like a really good brace to scoop up. Now he's 15 pounds, but guess what? There's a lot of people who don't are fearful of bending at their spine to pick up objects even lighter than that. So what I want is people to have the resilience, strength, mobility to do those sort of things without the traditional form of a setup of a gym style movement. And I think that's a good way to look at it.
For sure. Yeah. And the whole full range of motion training, train through full ROM, and this sort of thing has gotten so popular now that you kind of miss the point of how we might use it at the start of someone's journey, where, using weight to move through a range of motion is more about using that weight to assist you into a range that you don't normally have access to, but still staying within the scope of some control, like not trying to force someone through this range of motion, right? So when we teach flexibility and how to strengthen these ranges of motion, it does come down to now, like a lot of what you just said, educating the person on what we're doing here. It's like we're learning to strengthen and move in this pattern to feel like confident to do so. And then in our programming, it's about understanding, okay, if we're going to start doing Jefferson curls, there's going to be a big focus on the eccentric phase. So this is where we're now loading the tissues in their most vulnerable positions at length. We're also doing that within a weight that allows us to just move outside, slightly outside of our current range of motion. So we're learning to get into this new range of motion. We're not trying to load it up super heavy. We're thinking about technical qualities now of moving with a round back, of stretching the hamstrings under load. And this is more so what needs to be taught rather than avoiding a rounded back. we need to educate people on how to facilitate that in their training. And I really try to do that with a lot of the content I produce, is to say, like, this looks unsafe, but this is where you start, right? And I think when you also look at some of the higher level athletes that use these unconventional lifts or methods of training, like throwers, javelin throwers, and track and field athletes are one. I love their training and I share a lot of it. It looks super weird. They really use their spine and they're really bendy with weight. But in sharing that, you can break that down and say, like, your body is built to move this way, but you wouldn't start there, right? So you give people this visualization of like, oh, I am actually built to be a little more resilient through these different movements. But how do I start? Where do I begin? And what's the approach to that kind of training?
If you took slow motion capture of any athlete in any sport, you would see them interacting with forces, especially at high force, high velocity,
Yeah.
in unconventional ways, and getting sometimes pushed or having to resist against, or even as they move and sprint in what we would consider unconventional positions. They're not locked into rigid form the way you would
Yeah.
see with the traditional idea of a squat, the traditional idea of a row, the traditional idea of a hinge.
Yeah.
So under, again, like I said, high forces and unpredictable forces, let's say football players, hits, blocking, etc., acceleration is a sprint, you're getting into those positions anyway. So those kind of athletes have that ability. So it's not like this stuff, as we see it in a video, might be like, oh, well, I can't see a practical implication for that. It's like people use that in our everyday lives. And I think, again, when we're reaching into positions and picking up objects, what have you, we're often doing this stuff unconsciously. So I could see
Mhm.
the value of, at least for me, the big thing is feeling safe to do it, getting strong and confident by progressively approaching, like you just said, you've said a lot
Mhm.
about smart planning to build strength, start or easy. And it's about living not in fear for
Yeah.
me. Now, what
Yeah.
about, you mentioned flexibility a lot, and I
Yeah.
know you had a post and you talked about a lot of the misconceptions about flexibility. What are some of the big ones?
Um, like one of the more annoying ones is that it's only, neural, like stretching. I guess when we talk more about stretching, it's, stretching is only neural, it's very temporary. So when you stretch, you get yourself into a range of motion that is not there if you go to do it again later. Um, but the argument there is that, like, everything's temporary unless you do it consistently over time, right? So when we first start our strength training, we're not strong. Like, we have to progressively build over time and do that. And stretching is very much the same. A lot of the newer evidence coming out on stretching is leaning more towards like its value and how you would do it in such a way where it can help you. And the key factor in all of these papers is that, like, intensity is what it comes down to. So when we stretch or we facilitate stretching into a training regime, the big outcome is, like, if the intensity is there, is when change occurs, and it kind of assists the architecture of the muscle in different ways, which is, again, not a common practice. Flexibility or stretching in general is mostly considered as a very passive, relaxed style approach to training. But when we're actually building it into programming in such a way where we're trying to improve range of motion, intensity is like of the stretch, and overloading of the stretch is what it really comes down to, the same way we approach strength training. So I would say that would be like one that stands out a lot, is people say, like, you can't actually permanently change your range of motion, which is bullcrap. What are some other ones? It decreases power. So that's a big one too, right? Is like, if you stretch, it'll decrease your power output through a training session. But again, if we look at these studies, it's not best practice. So when we think about, like, how we would use stretching protocols for athletes in an event or in a session or throughout their training, the practices used in these papers aren't of commonly used practices. So we're not going to, like, overstretch someone for a long period of time before they go for a max sprint. We would do it a couple hours before and pair it with some dynamic active stretching. If we were building it into a training session, we would think a little bit more about, like, the relationship between the exercises that we're using. So then we would get into, like, interset stretching, and there's some good evidence on interset stretching and how it benefits us when we're using it through the antagonist approach. So we're using a stretch that's opposing the movement that we're strength training. And a lot of evidence showcased there is that we are going to be able to get more reps per set if we're applying the right intensity and it's with the right relationship of the exercise that we're using.
Is that because
But
it temporarily inhibits? So it sort of goes to the myth about it makes you not as strong, but
yeah,
very temporarily, right before
yeah,
the set, that it inhibits the antagonist muscle, so the agonist muscle can produce more force. Is that what's happening?
yeah. And this is actually what's happening in a stretch, right? So, like, if we are holding a stretch, what we're actually trying to do there is work on getting stronger in that range of motion through that relationship of the antagonist and agonist muscle groups. So there's isometric contractions occurring if it's being implemented in that contract relax sort of approach. Um, we're not really ever relaxed in a stretch either. So like there's also good evidence out there to show that the muscle is always under some type of tensile load, whether it's a really low level of it or a high degree, depending on the type of person. And that tensile load becomes stronger over time and the architecture of the muscle changes. So some of those protocols aren't very practical with like holding a stretch for 5 minutes every day or 10 minutes or whatever, but there are other ways for us to consider implementing that. And it does show that this idea of stretching being only passive isn't necessarily the case. So when we get back to that conversation of like vulnerable positions, if I know that this position for me was like maybe, for example, maybe I have a bad shoulder and I can't necessarily strength train in this position, but if I am put into a stretch, I am now under some tensile loading there. It may be a low graded exposure, but it's enough to start building some strength. And I think that's like the connection people need to start making with why stretching may or may not help them in those scenarios is like it actually introduces you to vulnerable positions. It allows you to start thinking about getting strong. And over time, we can actually start integrating movements there. So, it for me, it is even the most valuable in just that people that come to me with issues with their knees or their shoulders or their back, I'm able to use stretching as an initial intervention to start creating some graded exposure to these areas. And then we can start building confidence up over time with that.
This stuff's very smart. So let's get your thoughts on traditionally, there's a very strong belief that you need to stretch to alleviate injury risk. And then you get a lot of evidence, traditional research, that sort of said, no, there's no relationship between stretching and injury
Right.
risk directly. However, that's probably a very narrow way to look at it.
Yeah.
So where's the evidence and what has been your observations about people who have better mobility? And I suspect, because you've been saying this all along, it has to do with the ability to control those positions
Right.
and the nature of injury risk.
Yeah, for sure. Like there really isn't good evidence out there to suggest that stretching would prevent injury. There's not really good evidence to suggest that anything prevents injury. But what we need to do is we need to put our coach's hat on and just think for a second here. If athlete A has better flexibility than athlete B, and they both get the same injury, let's say, for example, they injure their knee, and through the rehab process, the athlete with better flexibility has more movement options. Will their recovery process be better than the one who doesn't? Most likely it will be. So I think when you start to look at it through that lens, where if I have not necessarily saying that stretching is going to prevent injury, but if I have improved my range of motion and flexibility so that I have more movement options if and when I need them, for example, if I do get injured, most likely my recovery process is going to be more enjoyable and probably more accelerated. So I think that's an easy way to bridge the gap for people that think more about injury and how it can be mitigated better. So why not work on flexibility? Why not work on developing a base level? And I guess the other discussion there with some of the myths that you talked about there is like it's very genetic. A lot of people will say that your flexibility is based on your genetics, maybe to a certain extent, but I think that would be at a very high level of flexibility. Like to think that everyone can do the splits to a very extreme level, that might be a bit of a reach, but certainly everyone can improve their flexibility if it's broken down for them and they know what they're working for. And if they are able to do that, then certainly I think they're going to have a better recovery process over time if they do get injured, or even just the aging process in general.
What about hypermobility? I know that was in your myths post as well, where you said that, I mean, some people are afraid that, stretching will cause hypermobility.
I mean, there's individuals that display hypermobility, and I think that just comes down to you being able to understand what they may or may not need. Stretching certainly won't cause hypermobility. If someone is hypermobile and let's say they can access range of motions better than people who aren't, we want to ensure that their training is balanced, because I mean, the issue there is that a hypermobile individual will often lean into things that they're good at. So it's like if the passive ranges feel better or easy, usually it's trying to bridge the gap with the strength training for them and trying to ensure that those ranges of motion are being uh, trained to be strong and under control as well. Um, there's no evidence to suggest that stretching and improving your range of motion is going to cause hypermobility. Hypermobility is specific to certain types of individuals, but even still at that point, it's more just about identifying the key factors in their training to ensure that they are working on the right things. But yeah, there's no real concrete evidence of that.
It makes sense to me that there's almost a common thing between people who are trying to improve their mobility, which is still trying to strengthen progressively into the end ranges of motion. And someone with hypermobility, the primary consideration is to learn to control and stay strong towards those end ranges and being careful not to subject it to too much force or load in a position that they're not strong in. So
Yeah.
really, it's about strength at that end range for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be. I think it's important to look at, mid-range positions as well too. If you are looking at a hypermobile individual, it's sometimes easy to just like visually look at them go past that mid-range of motion and just right into that end range, and you're assuming they're strong. But say they're having issues and you haven't looked at mid-range positions, or, like all ranges of motion matter. I only laugh at that because I had a friend do a meme on that I was a part of, where the end thing was like all range matters. But uh, you know, to think that only end range strength matters, I think would be just overlooking a lot of what happens through a range of motion. And as we know with exercise, a lot of times it's the mid range of motion that becomes the most difficult for a lot of people. And we're trying to ensure that we're addressing all of those things. So depends on the person in front of you. Like certainly trying to improve someone's range of motion who's really restricted and tight, we are trying to get them into new ranges and have them like strengthen and understand that, and they could be stronger in a mid-range of motion. But yeah, the other flip side of it is like a hypermobile person who's never addressed the mid-range and they don't even understand how to coordinate that. So it's kind of hard to just pinpoint it to one thing. I know that everyone always wants the one answer, but it's always, person individual in front of you, and what kind of tools can you pull out from your toolbox to be able to help them, right?
So for the person who's listening and going, well, again, some of this like splits and maybe these things are a bit outside of their interest. Where do you like to start people in terms of maybe unconventional exercises, but yet accessible ones for the everyday person that they might feel safe doing, they might be curious about, that might be maybe less aggressive?
Some basic human qualities I think are important to look at, like a squat, right? So it's like if you can't squat comfortably and feel like you can sit in that range, like how can we work towards obtaining that? Touching your toes, I think, is pretty obtainable for anyone who wants to put the work in and learn how to do that. Being able to hang from a pull-up bar comfortably, let your shoulders actually let the muscles like lengthen and relax. Like I look at the hang as a loaded stretch. And a lot of people, don't consider it spending time in that position as much. And basic human function things like that, I think, are important to look at and often overlooked in training, more so the time spent in those positions. So I try to help people understand things like that. Even in my basics programming, I do introduce people to uh, long and wide stance positions that are specific to splits, but it's not necessarily about getting a split, but understanding like an outer range position and what qualities are needed at the hip. So, I think even just those simple things can make a big difference. Learning to move your spine in all directions. The Jefferson curl, obviously, spine flexion has had a big focus in the industry in recent years, but we look at spine extension and the way the spine moves and other patterns, like how can we introduce individuals to those and have them gain an understanding of like strength on both sides of that movement. Even, yeah, basic strength qualities. I do like machine work. I'm not against training on machines, but again, I think for a lot of people that struggle with movements, machines are often the safe and easy way to go, and then they don't necessarily look at some of those basic movement functions as things to progress towards. So I may even just ensure that someone has a balanced approach with, training through full range of motion on a machine and ensuring that that's carrying over to everything else they're doing in life. Because I think sometimes you can get a little lost on training on machines, right? And still not able to grab your cat and twist and rotate very good. So,
What
I think
what
those
about
are,
what about stuff like sissy squats, Cossack squats? Do you
yeah,
like
I
those?
like those. Yep, definitely. Um, Restoring like full knee flexion. I may not start someone off on a sissy squat, but a big focus on trying to restore the flexibility of knee flexion if it's usually not there for people. So if you're looking at like a couch stretch, we're looking at kind of loading patterns like that and then building up to a sissy squat. Sissy squat's a great goal to work towards for someone that just hasn't really trained it before or, hasn't considered improving their range of motion in that capacity.
Can you explain what a sissy squat and a Cossack squat are for someone who's not quite sure? That's
Yep.
probably a fair thing.
Sissy squat, like one of the easiest ways to think about it is squatting without hip flexion. So your hips stay extended the whole time. So you can imagine the torso stays rigid. We're leaning back. And, there's a couple ways it's presented nowadays. The old school sissy squat was always more about the torso coming back more to lengthen the quads. So when we think about what we're doing at the quads, the more that we lean back or that we're able to lean back, the more lengthening strategy we're going to get through the quads. So not your knees don't necessarily need to go to the floor if you have support and you're able to find a nice leaning back position. But basically, you're thinking about that. It's like your hips aren't moving into flexion like they do with a traditional squat. Your hips are staying extended, and we're trying to bring the knees forward. Cossack squat, it's like a side to side squat. So your legs are opened wide and you're squatting side to side. And it's a great exercise to work towards because like you're getting mobility on the straight leg. So your adductors and groin is improving its mobility through a range of motion. You're improving single leg strength, which can progress to like a single leg squat pattern. You're gaining mobility at the hip through rotation and you're understanding certain qualities that don't usually get trained. There aren't many, I don't even think there's a machine that we could simulate a Cossack squat on. I'm trying to think. No.
Another way to look at this is, and I don't like using uh, frontal, transverse, sagittal plane in language for everyday people because I find you say the frontal plane and people think, well, moving, let's say like a walking lunge, that's that frontal. No, actually, frontal doesn't work that way at all. So I
Yeah.
find that language confusing. So I'm acknowledging that, but the Cossack squat, it's lateral movement. I prefer the word
Yeah.
lateral. And so very little of what is traditionally programmed in lower body training is lateral.
Right.
And so we have often a deficiency in strength there, but yet we still often move that way. We need that in every day. So to me, I mean, Cossack squats can be challenging. Lateral lunges, not a bad lateral lunge to a box, uh, but we don't get a lot of that. So I think programming that kind of stuff, dragging a sled laterally is a
Yeah.
wonderful way to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a good thing to mention there with like movements that we don't get a lot of. And when it comes to mobility training, like a lot of people today, it's grown so much that a lot of people it's really watered down and people are confused about what they need to be doing. And I think if you just look at traditional programming in general, it does cover most bases when it comes to improving range of motion. If you are practicing training through a full range of motion, what are you not doing? Right. So those are the things to think about in a program is like, yeah, lateral movements tend to not really be in a traditional approach if we're on like machines or just like general strength training. Movements of the spine tend to be very overlooked. Time, like stretching in general. And if you want to think of stretching more as time spent in lengthened positions, that tends to be overlooked. How can we improve that? And I think a lot of times when it comes to seeing like, what am I not doing? That's a better way to look at it than do I need to do these 20 new exercises to improve my mobility, or do I just need to do a couple things and then assess my goals kind of thing?
What about rep to rep consistency with form? I think there's a lot of misconceptions around this, and I think trainers can be guilty of this, that every rep has to look the same in order for it to be, quote, perfect form to be safe. And I think we're comfortable now saying there's not really a strong relationship between form and injury risk. So why is it important to actually allow for some variability rep to rep?
Well, I think too, it's about gaining an understanding of your body. I think when you have that like perfectionist approach to technique, it really limits you on pushing yourself to different levels. Like, I think a lot of people also come to me looking for coaching and support with improving their barbell strength. And barbell strength, of course, we need to understand good technique would look like in terms of like moving heavier weights, but we also need to understand what happens when we have heavier weights on our body. We need to actually understand how to grind through reps and know that things slow down. And when they slow down, like how does that look and feel? And yeah, embracing some deviation from perfect form. Like I think that's where you make the most amount of strength. Like that's the people who are the strongest in the world are able to do that or train within a certain percentage of that. I think for flexibility training, especially at the start, there's like some technical qualities I think that are important to get the most out of a stretch. So if you're trying to teach someone how to stretch certain lines to get an outcome and improvement, I do hold technique at a higher level with some of those things. And I think that's probably why it's not been as popular of a thing because it's not coached very well. So if you can get coached through your stretching in a way where you understand it better, I think there can be a better outcome that way. But when you look at the corrective exercise, I guess, field or individuals that really hone in on that, the question to be asked is like, are we doing more harm than good by making people feel like they need to correct all these patterns all the time? And even in these perfect postures and positions, that's not really realistic, right? And that's why I like the old time odd lifts. Actually, if you look at a lot of those lifts, they look like corrective exercises, but they're done with heavy weight.
And I tend to
So
look
you
at
could think of like, go
I
ahead.
tend to I just tend to see that like being really strong and being comfortable at getting into different positions and like being able to control them, which again, that's tissue strength, tissue adaptation. I think the nervous system plays a big role in their nervous system feeling safe going in those ranges. That is corrective. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of where the evidence has taken us. It's not about these little rinky dink, hey, I've grabbed a band and I've done that, this little motion a bunch of times, this little motion a bunch of times. We're not going to create tissue adaptation unless we're getting probably near failure. Now, if we're dealing with a rehab situation where we are coming back from an injury, then you absolutely have to regress the load and tension on that tissue to something it can tolerate.
Yeah,
But
for
in
sure.
general, you probably need to take the stuff to near failure. And it kind of goes to what you were saying about movement as your muscle fibers tire, as motor units tire, then there's going to be deviation. The form is probably going to, movement's going to slow down. There may be
Mhm.
deviation in form. And in order to get close to true failure, we have to allow for a little bit of deviation in form. Not to
Yeah.
mention, if we don't get comfortable dealing with that deviation in form, then when you end up in those positions, otherwise under force, you're not prepared for them. And I think that can increase injury risk.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, not prepared for them and exposed to those sort of things. And that's a good thing that you brought up there. Just with regards to like the person at the early stages of rehab and like having to, get them up and running again and going through a lot of those really core basic things. But like what I see on my end a lot as well is that they only have to get them to a certain percentage of function, and then they're released and let go. And I think that's where a lot of these people are kind of being left in the dark, is like they got themselves to maybe 20-25% function, and then they're like, okay, I guess I'm cleared, but I still not I'm not able to move in the ways that I want to move again. And I think that's where we can intervene and find better strategies for those people. And hopefully, you know, I think it's important to build that relationship and bridge that gap. I know like the physio field, like it's so busy and packed that it's hard to like, again, you can't keep people that long. You do have to get them to a certain function and hope that they take responsibility of their fitness afterwards, which isn't always the case. People get released and then they just don't do anything. But there has to be that next level of like, okay, I have to keep going. I have to keep training and building this up. That initial rehab stage isn't enough to kind of move into the ways, I guess pain free doesn't exist, but this idea, right? Like of people getting to a point where they're pain free. I don't think that's really where their thought process needs to be. It needs to be more of getting to a point where they can self manage.
There's something related to this that I think is really important. I love that because taking responsibility and learning to be strong. Traditionally, we've seen a lot of is we get people who go into the physical therapy realm, and some physical therapists primarily manage these things through passive modalities, whether it's your needlings, your God forbid cupping. There's a variety of other things, and there's not really much evidence to support a lot of this passive stuff. I've seen Adam Meakin's like ripping apart Shockwave, which there was a lot of buzz about recently, or up to recently. And what I'm afraid of is that someone's going to go into the physio realm. They're going to work with physical therapists who don't understand or value resistance training, which the smart ones, your Dr. Sam Spinelli's, your Dr. Susie Squats, they're the ones that understand, okay, the real rehab power is out of actually like training this tissue and strengthening it. And then because we have regression to the mean anyway, if you are in pain, you're injured, outside of certain catastrophic type injuries, regression mean means that it will heal and the pain will regress, right? So are the passive modalities temporarily alleviating the pain? Probably, but is there also a lot of just like natural, you're going to feel better anyway, whether or not you went to the chiro, whether or not you went to the physio. That's a real thing, real thing.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people attribute, hey, like I'll go to the physio. It's going to make me feel better. Great. Okay. As long as like the money's not an issue, right? So there's some stuff there. Don't get too deep into that. But if gap is still, hey, I don't have the skills to get strong, I'm feeling better, and then they just go back to whatever life was that got them there in the first place, then to me, that increases risk of dealing with this sort of thing again and all the other crap that happens with getting older and not
Yeah.
staying strong. So there's a big cocktail of awful there in theory. Again, I think all roads go through let's get strong, let's get you comfortable working through a variety of ranges of motion. And the challenge with some of the things we're talking about, because some of this gets a little technical, I hope we haven't lost people. I really want to direct people to actually go in, look at visual stuff you're doing. Your
Yeah.
videos on Instagram are great. I haven't dug in, but I'm assuming there's some YouTube stuff as well that
Yeah.
goes deeper. And people are going to actually get to see a bit more of what we're talking about. So this can kind of be the gateway into that. So I hope people will go check you out. Your Instagram handle is at Range of Strength. Are
Yeah.
there any other resources that you want to direct people to who've listened to this and went, wow, I'm actually curious about exploring this?
Yeah. I mean, I think you'll find everything you're looking for on the website, like just overviews of things. There are some nice deep dives on YouTube, and YouTube's a nice platform where you can share longer form content and dive deeper into like some of the background of these things that we're talking about with regards to training, flexibility, and improving those ranges of motion. And I've produced some good content there with that. So certainly a deeper dive would be helpful going there. Um, in person, like, I don't know, nothing beats in person to me. And I still do teach workshops and I try to get out. So if you can get to a workshop, I think, live kind of in person, hands-on kind of learning that stuff is always, I think, best resource. But yeah, that'll be your best bet to go check out those resources. And
Do you have any workshops coming up? Because you're based in Nova Scotia. So now here's a
yeah,
fun little thing, all right? So sometimes, because I'm originally from Newfoundland, and sometimes people will refer to me as a maritimer, okay? Newfoundland is not one of the maritime provinces. And Newfies, we get kind of tricky about that one. But Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI are.
yeah.
So where do you tend to teach them locally? Do you travel around?
I travel around more so. My following has grown more outside of Nova Scotia. There's like a lot of people here still don't know what it is that I do. But my next one is April in Texas, Austin, Texas. I'll be going there teaching a workshop. Yeah, they're fun 2 day events. We get into flexibility and then we get into some unconventional lifting and some background on that stuff, get people safely understanding how to explore those movements and use them in their own training.
Sounds cool. Sooner or later, we'll cross paths in our travels at one of these events. So, and I mean, if you ever end up in Edmonton, Alberta, guess what? That's an easy one, right?
Yeah.
Uh, anyway, as one East Coaster to another, it's great to have you on. I hope everybody will go and follow you at Range of Strength and then do a bit of a deeper dive. And for everybody listening, again, if you guys are enjoying these episodes, there's a lot more coming. I know there have been, mobility, flexibility based training has been a bit of a theme, injury rehab stuff. I think these things are very relevant to people as we're getting a little bit older and, our bodies are changing. And hey, it doesn't bounce back or everything doesn't feel as good as like well, shit, even in my 30s, right? I'll be 47 in about a month. I think you're in your early 40s, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of our philosophy as we get older shifts. I am about to record later today with Joe DeFranco. So, you guys, assuming everything goes well, you guys will get that episode. And Joe also wants to talk about longevity and changes to training as we get older to manage injury risk. So, it's a
Yeah.
common theme. But I'll have a lot of other really cool stuff for you guys too. So, thanks for tuning in. Please share this if you like it. Share it with someone in your world that you think would really enjoy your media, Lucas, or just this podcast in general. And please tag me up on social media. I love that. You guys are amazing. Thanks for tuning in. I've been thrilled with how much this is growing, and you guys listening are the reason for that. So thank you so much.